The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hi everybody. Welcome to the fifth module of the Lunch and Learn series. Welcome wherever you are. I just want to check to make sure our normal sound check. Could I just get people to just type in the word clear in the question box to make sure that we're coming across loud and clear. Thanks, Denise. Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, John. Thanks, Maxine. Thank you. Good. Thanks, Elsie. I hope you had a nice break. Thank you. Okay, look, it looks like things are coming across loud and clear, which is wonderful. Now, we're going to look at an interesting topic today, which is about the roles that people play in teams. Now, the interesting thing about this is that there was some research done quite some time ago by an academic called Meredith Belbin. And Meredith Belbin was a male, just as a matter of interest. And what he came up with was the theory that when people congregate together in a team, what they actually do is they play a certain role. Now, the role that they play sometimes is subconscious. So, for example, if we all landed on a desert island, we're sitting around the campfire and we're thinking, how do we get rescued? And of course, how do we survive? Two dual, not necessarily competing imperatives. Each of us sitting around that campfire would play certain roles. And some of us would say, for example, make a contribution like, well, look, let's go up to the top of the mountain. Let's check to see where we are and survey the island. Others would say, well, I think we need to work out what our priorities are. And others would make other comments. So really what I'm trying to do today is to give you an understanding of a framework, if you like, to actually look at your people and work out what roles they like to play in teams, which is extremely important. No problem, Julene, that's fine. Thank you. Just letting me know that you're coming in. So we play these roles and sometimes we aren't even aware of it. So the important thing is to sort of look at your team members and try to understand what roles they like to play. So let's just make sure we just do a quick recap before we move in. So in Unit 1, we talked about the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams, and the point about that was, of course, to attempt to try and make sense of your team, perhaps work on one of those 8 areas, such as building trust. And the good news was, or is, when you work on one of those characteristics, it's likely to impact positively on other characteristics in the team. So that's the good news. We looked at the 4 stages of team development. That was the Tuckman model. You might recall we talked about forming, storming, norming, performing. And of course, the objective is to get the team to that final stage if possible. And we looked at some tools of leading teams, and really it was that competing concept of working with tasks that have to be done and relationships that have to be maintained. And a good leader will fluctuate between the two depending on the circumstances they're in. And of course, I shared with you many models around that, and I hope you've had some fun with that. So in Unit 4, I think I said Unit 5 last time, it's Unit 4, we're going to be looking at the roles that people play in teams. And as usual, you'll get the recording of this, you'll get the slides at the end, maybe not this afternoon. No, you won't get them this afternoon, but you'll get them over the weekend. So you'll have them there if you wish to go through. So just relax and don't need to take too many notes. It'll all be here for you. All right, so I'm going to look at the 8 team tasks. Now, I'm going to use, and I know some of you have been exposed to this because I've worked with you, but I'm going to use the team management profile system to actually look at this. Now, there are a whole lot of different systems out there that are very much based on Meredith Belbin's work, but I'm going to look at the 8. I'm going to look at the team values, the team management profile. And in that team management profile, the two people who put that together actually have come up with 18 tasks that are critically important, and they'll make perfect sense to you if you're not exposed to this model before. Then we're going to look at a concept called Rhino, which stands for Relationships, Information, Decisions and Organisation. So these things drive and inform the way people like to make decisions and contributions in teams. And then we'll look at a team profile of some clients that I've worked with, and you can actually see, for example, where people fit in around these 18 tasks that I'm going to mention. So really the objective of today is to give you a chance to actually look at your team and try and make some judgments in relation to how the team or team members like to play roles in their team. Now, obviously, one of the roles they play is the job that they do. I'm not necessarily talking about that. I'm talking more about how they like to contribute to team discussions, what they bring to the team in terms of their own personal preferences. So that's really what I'm on about, not so much about their tasks, because obviously that's or should be laid out in your job description, and I'm not going to go there today. Okay, so the team that you lead, or the members of the team that you lead, pretty much have two hats, or they play two roles. Now, the functional role is what I've just mentioned. That is what's in their job description. So you've got, whatever the key performance indicators are, what you evaluate their performance on, that's the functional hat. Now, I'm not going to go there today because, frankly, you're the experts in that area. You know exactly what, hopefully, people should be doing or shouldn't be doing, and I won't go there. But there is another role or another hat that people have when they come together as a team, and that hat is the team members hat. So what we're actually trying to do in this Lunch and Learn series for you is to develop the team members hat. So whenever you get your team together for a stand-up meeting or a sit-down meeting, or whenever you talk to your team members individually, what you're hoping, unless you're talking to them specifically about the job that they're doing in the team, what you're hoping is that they will have their team member hat on. Now, what I mean by that is they're looking at the team overall. They're not just looking at their own patch. So this is the hard hat. I guess it's not a hard hat in front of you, but it is the harder hat to actually develop. So it's important for you to start developing people's concept of a team role. So one thing you could do very practically out of this is just say, look, when you're working in this team, you wear two hats essentially. One is the job that you do, which of course is governed by the job description. And the other hat that you wear is you are a member of the team, and we want you to be thinking as a team member. So that second hat is the most challenging of the two hats. But if you're looking at developing a high-performing team and you've just got a bunch of individuals that come together and just do their job, and they really don't care about the general output of what happens as a team, then of course you've got problems. So what I'm trying to do here is help you develop that team member hat, which I think is very, very important. Now, those of you who haven't been exposed to the team management systems methodology, just give you a bit of an idea. It didn't come out of a breakfast cereal pack. It is actually well researched. It's very simple to understand. It manages diversity, and it's interesting that we talk about diversity in terms of age and gender, and there's a lot of discussion about that at the moment. Sure, those things are, of course, very important, but there is another type of diversity that I want to share with you today, and that's the diversity about how people think. So each person in your team comes to the team with a different way of thinking, and your job, if possible, is to try to harness that as much as you can for the betterment of the team. So what the team management systems does is it gives you a very good framework to be able to do that. And if you choose to do it, of course, you can do the diagnostics through team management systems. And if you're interested in doing that, of course, I'm more than happy to help you with that. And I know many of you in this broadcast have actually done this. So you'd be well and truly aware of your own role preference, but you may not be aware of the role preferences of your team members. So I'm hoping that some of these characteristics of the framework will help you to look at your team members in a different light with that team role hat that I mentioned before. Now, when Meredith Belbin put together his model around team preferences, his argument was that they are preferences. In other words, this is a preferred way of thinking. So people come to the team with a preferred way of wanting to contribute and to think. And it's important that I mention that because it's not a skill-based type of proposition. So we're not talking about people's skills here. We're talking about the way people like to think. Now, the key thing here is if you can harness that approach and way of thinking, and you can do that in an effective way, and I'll show you how you might do that in this short session, you will probably get much better results from your team. So the important thing to remember here, it's how people people prefer to operate. And the way people like to operate is based on what I call the rule of the 3 Ps. Now, the rule of the 3 Ps is pretty straightforward and it'll make a lot of sense to you. We tend to practice what we prefer, and when we practice what we prefer, we ultimately become proficient in it. So people will come to the team with practice what they prefer. They'll come to the team with a certain way of approaching things. And I'm sure you're aware of this. And it might be a different preference to you, which could drive you mad. Or it could be something that's really important, but if you can harness it correctly. But because they practice it over and over again, because they prefer to do it, then ultimately what happens is they become quite proficient in that way of thinking. So that really underpins the need to try to actually exercise some of these preferences that I'm going to share with you today. Whoop, I went too far there. Let me just go back one slide. So if you look at the team management model, and it's one that I'm very familiar with and I'm accredited in, but there are many other models. There's the Belbin model, but essentially they all point to the same concept, and that is that each of us come to a team, as I mentioned, with a particular mindset, a particular role that we want to play. And what you're seeing in front of you now is the wheel that comes out of the team management systems wheel. And you'll notice that around the wheel we've got labels like promoting and developing and organising and producing and inspecting and maintaining and advising and innovating. And if you do the profile, what it does is it shows you where you prefer to operate around that wheel. But what the authors argue here is that all of those 8 tasks are critically important for team success. So the question for you is, where might people be sitting around the wheel, so to speak, and how might you be able to exercise and utilise that more effectively in the performance of your team? And that's what we're really on about today. So I'll give you a brief description now of each of these 8 tasks that I mentioned. And while I'm giving you a brief description of these tasks, you might like to think, well, where do I fit in? Where do I enjoy impacting in a team? Because remember, you're a member of a team as well. Even though you are probably likely to be the team leader, so you have a certain role as far as leading the team, but you also have a set of preferences as well. And so you will find that your leadership of the team will be heavily skewed by your way of thinking. So you might want to think about, where do I fit in around the wheel, if you haven't already done the profile. If you have, of course, you'll know. The other thing I'd like you to do is to think about your team members. Where might they fit around the wheel? Now, sometimes it'll be hard to work that out. Other times it'll be very, very obvious and straightforward. but at least I want you to have a look at it through the lens of what you prefer to do and what you think each of your team members prefers to do as well. Okay, so let's have a look at each. Okay, now, I went too far again. Let's go back one. So I'm going to start with advising. And by the way, if you've got any questions or comments, clarification or whatever, you know what the drill is. Just type in the question box there. Bear in mind, I'm the only one that sees the question. No one else sees the question. And of course, I'll refer to that question. And if I feel that I shouldn't mention your name, I'll do that as well. So I'll keep my eye out on that. But as we go through, so the people who the advising role is really about gathering and reporting on information. So people who like to do this in a team environment will have a tendency to make comments like, I'll go and speak to the person concerned, find out what they want and report back at the next meeting. So they actually like to go out and gather information and report back. So a typical occupation, of course, would be a journalist. They'll go out, they'll ask a lot of questions, they'll try and get to the bottom of a story. We all know they don't always print it accurately, but they'll certainly try to get to the bottom of the story. That's their job. So this role is critically important in a team because these people will scrutinise the information that comes in. How do you know that's real? Where did you get your information from? Are we working on the right information? So these are the sort of questions that people who like to advise are often thinking. And of course, if they feel comfortable, they're often expressing that in team meetings. So it's critically important because obviously if you don't have quality information coming in at your team meetings from a range of sources and stakeholders, such as what are we doing next week, what's our schedule and all the rest of it, then clearly it's going to mean that your team is not going to be performing where it needs to be. So moving around the wheel, once we've got the right information that we need in order to make a decision or solve a problem, the next step is that we have to start innovating. Now, I'm not talking about the innovation such as a Google type of innovation. I'm talking about innovation in terms of creating and experimenting with ideas. So people who are quite innovative, who like playing that role in the team, will often say things like, I'd like to suggest another way of tackling this issue that hasn't already been considered. So these people will often think outside the square. They'll come to the team meeting with another proposition or another idea, or another way of looking at things. Now, if a team has a pretty set and standard procedure, that could be a source of annoyance for you as the team leader or anybody else in the team because, there's a set way that we do things. So, for example, in a health and safety environment, there are certain things that have to be done. There is very little room for creativity. But the innovators are always looking at new and better and faster and easier ways of doing things. Now, whether they contribute that or not at a team meeting will pretty much depend on their level of comfort. Okay? So once we've got the right information, we've got to work out how we're going to resolve the problem. And so we've got to toss around some ideas, and that's where the innovators come into play. The next particular role, once we've got the right information and we've tossed around some ideas about how we might resolve it, is we need to start to promote. And what promoting does is it's about exploring and presenting opportunities. So a person who's a natural promoter in a team context would be someone who might make the following contribution. They might say, we should sell the benefits of this approach to others before we go ahead and do this. So what they're doing is they're always thinking about the stakeholders beyond the team and how they might actually pitch their idea or their suggestion or their solution more effectively. And of course, that's critically important because your team doesn't work in a vacuum. You have a number of different stakeholders that you work with, both internal and external to the organisation. So people who are promoting are always considering how that might occur. So do you have any natural promoters in your team? And if you do, what could you do about, harnessing that preference in your team discussions? So you can imagine if a team doesn't have someone that likes promoting, the team can often be working in isolation and no one else knows what's going on. And that's not necessarily a good thing, of course. So promoting is an important role, as are the others that I mentioned. So let's recap. We've got the right information. We have thought about how we're going to resolve the problem. We've thought about who we need to involve in that in terms of promoting. We've now got to start to develop our ideas a little bit further. So developing is about assessing and testing the applicability of a new approach. Will it fly? Will we be able to put this into practice? Now, so a typical comment that someone in a team meeting might make is something like, before we commit to this, I think we should give it a trial run first and develop a plan B if it doesn't work. So the developers are always thinking about whether or not the idea can actually be translated into reality. So they're obviously very important in terms of making the link between a concept and a reality. And so I remember working with a management team where there were 5 developers in the team. In terms of their natural preferences, there were only 6 people in the team and there were 5 developers. And so you can imagine what their discussions were like. They were tossing around how this would implement, and they spent a lot of time and energy on this because that's how they liked to come to the team. That was the contribution that they liked to make. So now let's go back. We've got the right information. We're now working out how we're going to achieve it by innovating. We're now looking at our stakeholders and how we might engage them in the process, and we've now worked out how we're going to develop our plan. The next step is that we've got to sort of roll our sleeves up and organise to make something happen. But this isn't the actual doing. The organising role is very much about establishing and implementing the ways to make things work. So this is very much putting down a plan of action, a milestone. A typical comment that someone might make in a team environment that has this preference would be, can I suggest that we might organise things this way? And this becomes pretty important because sooner or later we've got to get down and get something done. Otherwise the team just becomes a talk fest. So, and I know I have a preference in this area, and I'm very frustrated often if I'm sitting around in a team and we're not getting anywhere. And I'll often find myself jumping in, whether I'm chairing that meeting or not, and make those sorts of comments like, I'd like to suggest that we do this as step 1, or let's map out a process about how we're going to achieve this. I dare say some of you have a preference in this area as well. It's quite common for a team leader to have a preference in this area. And so getting down to action is very, very important to the organiser. And now, once we've got the information, we've thought about how we're going to put, an idea down. We're going to learn how to promote what we need to do. We've developed the idea so that it becomes practical, and we've organised some steps forward. You can imagine that the next step is actually producing results. And producing results is very much around concluding and delivering tangible evidence or tangible things. So your team, if anyone in your team has a preference in this area, and I hope they do, it would be that they would make comments like this: before we move on, tell me exactly what you need me to do before the next meeting. So they very much respond to very practical, very tangible things that have to be done. So producers are the realists in the team. In fact, often they're not interested in the big picture. They're really just interested in what has to happen next and what my role in that is. So producers are those that want to get their hands on and get the results done. Now, obviously, a team that doesn't have people that enjoy doing that probably will be less productive than somebody or a team that has somebody that likes doing that. Now, you might say everyone's got a responsibility to do that. That's true. But in the contribution in the team meeting, the producers will be the ones that'll move the conversation to the tangible outcomes that need to be, achieved before we move any further. Then we have to, after we've done all this, so we've now up to number 7. So we have got the right information. We have thought about ways that we can make this work. We have engaged our stakeholders. We have developed a plan. We have now organised the steps involved. We've now produced results. We now need to make sure that we've inspected our results. We need to measure our success. So people who like to inspect are those that will often ask questions or they like to control and audit the working of systems. So they will make comments like this: how are we going to know that we are successful? So how will we know that? So, these people are very much around the key performance indicators. They want to see the tangible way that we're going to measure success. Now, obviously, that's important because otherwise the team doesn't know really. So these people are very detail focused, and they tend to look back to make sense of the future. So a typical example of that is that if you're completing a budget for next year, the obvious place to go would be to look at last year's budget and to build upon that budget. So that would be a classic inspecting role. So one last task that's required in a team, and that is the maintaining task. Now, interestingly enough, the research shows that only 2% of the population have a high preference in this area. But people who like to maintain are people who like to uphold and safeguard standards and processes in the team. So they will be the ones that will want to check under the bonnet. They will be the ones that will want to review how the team is actually travelling as a team. So they're very acutely aware when there's fractures in the team or the team isn't performing to where it needs to be. They'll often make contributions like this in a team meeting. They'll say things like, didn't we all agree that we'd meet fortnightly no matter how busy we are, and we should really stick to our commitments? So they keep the team honest to the commitments that they've made in terms of the team. Now, obviously, that can be valuable because you might argue that that's your role. Well, I guess it is. But of course, if you don't have a high preference in this area, it's likely that that will become less of a priority than other areas, even though you know it's something that needs to be done. So these people are kind of like the conscience of the team, if you like. They keep the team on track and keep it moving in the right way. So that's the 8 areas of, or the 8 tasks. Does anyone have any questions they want to ask me at this point about any of those 8, or perhaps how they might apply as well? Okay. All good? Okay. So let's try and bring this all together so you kind of understand how this all works. So if you consider a problem-solving approach, let's say that you have a problem that needs to be resolved in your team. Now, it can be, any problem whatsoever. It can be a fairly complex issue or a fairly, fairly simple issue, I guess. Irrespective of what it is, it's likely that whether you realise it or not, you need to actually cover all of those 8 areas in order to achieve success. Now, you don't sit there pedantically and saying, okay, now we're promoting, you don't do that, but it does. It is supposed to happen anyway, and I'm just making you conscious of this. Let's have a look. So the very first question that has to be asked when someone plonks a problem in front of your team, or you put the problem in front of the team, is this: what information do we need to resolve this problem? So the advisors will be thinking about that, because obviously if you don't get the quality information, you're not going to be able to make a quality decision. So the very first question is around what information do we need? Once we've established what information we need, the next step is to work out some ways of resolving it. So the innovators will think to themselves, what are some of the ways open to resolving this problem? When there's leeway, of course, for new and better ways of doing things. So they will start to make, hopefully they'll make contributions, they'll at least think about it, about how we might tackle this differently. So they will be the ones that will often question the way we do things and perhaps come up with better or faster ways of doing things. Then once we've got that question out of the way and we've worked out some general idea about how we might move forward, then we need to address the question of how can we communicate our recommendations to others to obtain the resources we need. And the resources could mean just simply buy-in. How do we get other people on board to make sure that our approach will be supported? So that's what the promoters do. They think very much along those lines. And then once we've answered that question, we've then got to think, well, how do we test our ideas? So how do we actually make sure that our ideas are actually going to be practical? So the developers will be thinking about that, and they will think very carefully about how we do that. And hopefully, if they're encouraged to do so, they'll contribute their ideas to the team meeting. Then the next question we've got to ask is, of course, how do we establish a way of making this solution work? And this is about mapping out a stepping stone. This is about a plan. This is about putting things to some sort of a structure or framework around the way we will resolve this problem. And then once we've done that, we've now got to produce results. So the next big question is, what do we need? How can we deliver results? So this is we've got to get some tangible results. Otherwise, it's just talking. We've got to actually do something. So the producers will start to think along these lines. And the very final, or the second last question we've got to think about is, how do we measure our success? How will we actually know that the approach that we're going to use will actually be successful? How will we measure success? So the inspectors start to think about those sorts of things. And the very final question we've got to ask is, how do we maintain the team during this approach? How do we maintain the harmony and morale of the team as we go through this approach? That has to be considered at that time. So you can see now it's a very practical model, and if any of those 8 questions are not addressed, and I'm not suggesting for a minute that you go through all of those 8 questions, all I'm suggesting is that you be very mindful that all of these things are important, and that there are people in your team who are probably have a preference around some of these questions. And what you're trying to do is to encourage people's preferences when you're trying to resolve something in a team environment. Because, of course, as I said, if any of those go missing, it's likely to have a suboptimal performance level. So, for example, if, as number 3, promoting, if we don't spend a sufficient amount of time communicating our solution to the rest of the organisation, it's likely that roadblocks will appear all of a sudden, and we've got to down tools and sort out how we're going to resolve those communication issues. You see, so all of those things become really important. Now, you might say, well, isn't that my role to make sure all those things are done? Absolutely, it is. But to make it easier for you, the reality is you have a lot of the solutions in your team, and it's a matter of drawing on those preferences to enrich the opportunity for the team to achieve its success. Okay, so what the question often arises is, how do we actually work out people's preferences? And the way we do that is by what I mentioned before, which is a Rhino Scale, standing for relationship, information, decisions, and organisation. So on this scale here, we can plot people in terms of their natural tendency. So you'll notice the first one there is extraversion and introversion. And some people are prone towards the left, and some people are prone towards the right. And for all of those things, that's true. And once we've worked all that out, we can actually work out people's team preferences. So let's go through each one of those briefly and just consider some of the issues involved with the Rhino Scale. So if you look at relationships, there's a lot of commentary about all of you, of course, have heard the term extrovert and introvert. But I've got to say to you that there's a lot of rubbish that's written about these terms, completely misleading and completely inaccurate. All introversion and extroversion really means is how you and I like to recharge our batteries. That's all it means. So if we've had a very hard day, what do we like to do to sort of energize ourselves? So people who are on the left-hand side, who are extroverts, will tend to do that by engaging with other people. So they'll talk to people, they'll, just by doing that, they'll, recharge their batteries. On the other hand, on the right-hand side, people who are introvert are more likely to recharge their batteries by being on their own and doing something on their own. Now, you might say, well, hang on, it depends on how I'm feeling. True, and if that's the case, then you're probably likely to be smack bang in the middle between extroversion and introversion. And sometimes you're the life of the party and other times you're quite happy to be on your own. And a lot of us are like that. But the people on the extreme, on the left or the right, will have a tendency to stick to one particular way of recharging their batteries. Now, one's not better than the other, and I think this is where there's a lot of rubbish. A lot of people say, oh, yes, to be a leader, you've got to be an extrovert. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. 4 out of 10 CEOs in Australia, for example, would plot themselves on the introvert side. So it's not necessarily the case. The other misnomer about this is that extroverts love people and introverts don't. Not true. Not true at all. It just simply means that introverts are quieter, extroverts are not. Doesn't matter. It's no issue, and it doesn't mean that people don't like people. There's plenty of introverts that like people and enjoy people's company. It's just that they're not going to say too much in those situations. So that's the first interesting scale. And in your team, of course, you've got introverts and I guess, depending on the size of the team, but it's likely that you've got extroverts and introverts. And people often say to me, oh, look, do these things change throughout life? I don't really think so. I think what actually happens is you learn to moderate your behaviour. So, for example, if you're an extrovert, you've learned to shut up every now and again in meetings because, frankly, you annoy people if you're always talking. And for you introverts, you've probably learned to speak up in meetings because you'll annoy people because you don't say much. So you kind of end up being, adapting, if you like. But I don't think you actually change much in your life because that's your comfort zone. That's the way you like to operate. Now, the next one is information. Now, how do you like to gather and use information at work? Now, I'm going to share some information with you shortly, and I'm going to ask you over on the right-hand side to type in what you see. Now, there's no right answer here, so please, this is not a test, but I'm going to be, I do want you to type something in the question box, okay? And when you type something in, it'll give us a clue about whether you are a practical or creative in terms of the way you process information. So people who are practical will see what's in front of them, and people who are creative will often make inferences about the information that they receive. Are we ready? Here we go. I want you to type in, I don't want paralysis by analysis, just type in what you see. And let's go. Here it is. Now just type in what you see. You're still all thinking, aren't you? Just type in an observation. What do you actually see in front of you? And of course, there's no right answer. You just type something in. What do you see? What's the first thing that comes to mind? What is your assessment of this information? This information, of course, is, obviously pictorial information, but it will give us a clue about where you stand. All right, who wants to have a go? Okay, I won't mention names because you may not want that, but someone's just typed in, I see 4 people standing at a doorway. Now, is that a practical response or a creative response? Well, that actually is a very practical response. So they're not making any inferences about the people at the door. They're just seeing 4 people standing in a doorway. They're not trying to work out where they are, what they're talking about, or anything like that. So that's a very practical response. Anyone else, please? Oh, you're a quiet bunch today. We've got a lot of people in the broadcast, and I'm not sure whether, normally, anyone else? Okay, another one here says that they can see 4 people standing in a doorway talking to their leader. Okay, so they're making the inference that one of these people is actually the leader of the team. They're making an inference it's a team. They're also pointing out that they believe that 3 people are talking to the leader. I'm assuming you're seeing the leader as the person sort of in the middle of the picture there because everyone's deferring to them. So if you think about that response, you can obviously see that that response is it's a little bit more creative, isn't it? Because you're making an interpretation that there's a leader there and that these 3 people are actually part of a team who are working together. All right, any other responses? Okay, another one, sound. Oh, okay, I see. The sound's dropping in and out. That's a pity. Sorry about that. I don't know how we might do that. Another person says they see people. Well, that's obviously it's a reasonably practical response. Another person says they see people having a conversation. Well, that's a very practical response. Other people say they see people gathering in a doorway, fairly practical. People and dark space. So you're talking about a dark space, and so you're bringing some interpretation in. You see 4 people in a doorway, people talking in an alley, so just bringing up the idea that there's an alley just brings in a slight creative touch to it. People are waiting. Okay, so someone says people are waiting, so what that suggests is waiting for what? And why do you think they're waiting? What are they waiting for? Some person says they're discussing things, people hanging out, says somebody. I mean dark space, says Tracy. Tenants discussing a bad landlord and who won't fix the basic amenities. That's a very creative response. Yeah. People having a conversation, all looking at the lady on the right. Yep. They can see, can you see my answer, Tim? Yes, I can. People talking to each other. 4 people waiting for a shop to open. Well, that's pretty creative. So you're making an interpretation. Inputs coming through, people in a group at a door. I'm trying to send my response, but they don't seem to be going through. I think they are, Denise. My initial thought was a woman on the right is having trouble based on body language. Okay, and it goes on and it goes on. So, look, you can see that each of us are looking at it differently. Now, what that says, of course, is that we all approach information in different ways. I'm showing you exactly the same information, and yet you all have a different interpretation of that as such. Okay, so apologies about the sound, people. It's unfortunately one of those things that it could be at your end or my end, and I'm doing my best, so let's hope it continues. Let's talk about decisions. Now, decisions. How do you like to make decisions? So you might make decisions based on analysis, or you might like to make decisions based on a belief system. So people who like to be very analytical will tend to like to use statistics, graphs, charts, and all the rest. And people who are very belief-based will tend to wear their heart on their sleeve and make decisions based on a set of values. So if you look at this cartoon in front of you, it should be coming up on your screen at some point. Here we go. you can see that the person on the left-hand side is very, very analytical. Look at the way he is working, and there's no correlation between male and female here. It's just a cartoon of two people, but you'll notice that on his wall he's got all of these lists, and he's being objective. And you look at the person on the right-hand side and you can note that they have all this reading material around philosophy and beliefs and feelings and values, and they're talking about the principle of the matter. So how do you like to make decisions? Do you base decisions on values, or do you base decisions on analysis? Or if you're like me, it just depends on what it is that you're dealing with. Here's a little test. See, I'd like you to answer this if you could in your question box. Let me put it up for you. Okay, here we go. Oh, for some reason that's not, okay. Here we go. It'll take a little time to come up. There we go. So let me give you a little test. You've got 2 movie tickets to give away to your team, okay? But you've got 3 team members. So you've got 2 movie tickets, 3 team members. How are you going to decide who gets the ticket? How are you going to decide? So obviously it means someone's going to miss out under the current scenario. So how would you make that decision? So Sean says a lucky draw. Okay, now if you say a lucky draw, you're obviously looking at an analysis because you're using fairness based on a kind of process where people can pull it out of a hat. Drawing straws, says Denise, and again, that is an analytical approach. First in, says Greg, says Chris. So so first in's probably more likely to be belief, I suppose. It's a difficult one to work out in that sense. Throw the tickets on the floor and let them fight over it. Yes, that might be the way to resolve it. So I don't use lots of time to think of a quick decision. I will give the tickets to the team and they can sort it out. So we'll let them sort that out. Yeah, righto, I can see. I realise it's a joke. Have them decide between themselves. If I think deeper, I can see that the tickets are whether it's a family movie or what. So what you're saying there is that you are trying to match what's on at the movies with the people's preferences. Now we're talking beliefs, aren't we? So that's what Gavin's saying. So he would work out what's on at the movies and then give the movie tickets to those most suited. Someone says here, I'd work out performance. People have got a high performance would get those tickets. So that's very analytical. If you could of course, get a criteria around that. So you can see that you're all tackling that from a different perspective. And that's very interesting because what that means is that, we do come to decisions, don't we, in lots and lots and lots of different ways. So you make hundreds of decisions during a week, and the question is, do you make them on analysis or do you make them on beliefs? And think about your team members. Are they analytical or are they belief-based? Right? There's probably a mix of both in your team, which is most likely to be the case. All right. Now, the last one here is organisation. So are you a structured person or are you a flexible person when you like to organise yourself and others for that matter? So if I just show you this cartoon, which will come up on your screen shortly, you will note that the person that's on the right, it's still taking a bit of time to come up, so we might have a few internet issues here today. But here we go, it's up now. So the person on the right, you can see, clearly is very flexible the way they like to work. And the person on the left is very flexible. The person on your right there, on the other hand, is very structured. Everything in order, very orderly, systematic, and so forth. Now, again, one's not best because, flexible people are able to change direction a lot quicker. Structured people, of course, stick to a plan. So there's not one best way, but I would suspect that in your team you've got people who have a preference around being flexible and people who have a preference around being structured. So have a think about how that might work. So, all of that will have an impact on how you have your team discussions. And of course, how you like to structure yourself or not structure yourself will depend as well about the style of leadership around what you bring to the team. All right, so what I'm showing you here now is without mentioning the organisation, and you can only see the initials there. This is a team that we conducted, and you can see what we've done is we've put the names of everyone in the team, it's quite a large team, across the Rhino scale. So over the things that I've just covered, you can see that this team's got a nice spread of introversion and extraversion. It's more prone to being a practical team. It's a very, very analytical team, and there's only one belief-based decision maker in the whole team, you can see. And then over here, we've got quite a strong preference towards structure, although we have a number of people who are just on the side of flexible. So that gives us a sort of like a personality profile of the team, if you like, and that can be quite interesting if you wanted to go down that road. Here's another way of looking at it. The team on the left-hand side this is their primary preferences. Remember I said that everybody has a primary preference around the wheel. And then what you've got on the right-hand side, which is a very busy wheel, is showing you in lowercase people's related preferences. So you can see that for this team, you could argue it's a very organised, very productive team, probably could spend a little bit more time around innovation, probably a bit more, well, they've got nobody that's interested in reporting and advising, so the information or quality of the information coming into the team could be a bit of an issue, and that's not always a good thing if that's the case. Chelsea's just asking, isn't it easy being, it isn't easy being green in that team. No, good point, Chelsea, that if, for example, we put someone in the team and, they happen to be in this, they had a preference around reporter advisor. On the one hand, they'd be very, very valuable to the team because that's their natural preference, so that would be a good thing. But on the other hand, they may find that they're a lone voice. Nevertheless, it's an important voice, and it would be important to make people aware that that's critical. So you can see how these things can work in practice. All right, moving on. I've got some homework for you, and it's pretty straightforward homework. I hope you're going to do it anyway, but I just want you this afternoon or over lunch, whatever time it is where you are, is I would like you to observe your team. Just spend a bit of time looking at your team. Listen to what they're saying and try and work out what their natural preference is around that wheel. Some people it will be very, very obvious, and you probably already worked it out without even listening to your team. But for others, it might be quite difficult. And then try and just work out where they might sit around the wheel. And look, the key thing here is you're a bit like a conductor in an orchestra. What you're trying to do is to defer to people who have a natural tendency to think along these lines. And that's what the whole point of this is if you can defer at different times one of the tasks that we've gone through to a team member by just asking them a question, you will find that because of the 3P rule that I mentioned before, they're likely to give you a good answer because they naturally have a preference in that area and they'll practice it, they'll prefer it, and they'll become, obviously, as I said before, proficient. So have a think about that and just have a bit of fun with that and have a look at your team and consider how they like to operate. So that's the homework. I've got a little bit of time for another question or comment from anybody, but while you might be thinking about that, just come back to the series and where we're up to. You'll notice that the next unit is called Managing Team Conflict and Negotiation. And I'm going to send you out a diagnostic over the weekend. So you'll get the slides, you'll get the recording, you'll get another diagnostic. Now, this diagnostic is a paper version, and what I'd like you to do is to complete it, and that when we meet again in a fortnight, I'd like you to have that done. It won't take you too long to do, but I think you'll find it very interesting. What it will show you is how you like to deal with conflict, what your natural preference is. And what I'm hoping that we can do in the next meeting is give you some insight into some other ways of dealing with conflict that you might not naturally feel comfortable with, so that you can broaden your array, because let's face it, anyone working in a team, there's going to be all sorts of negotiation and conflict going on all the time. And what happens is you'll tend to gravitate to your own style, but what I'm trying to do is to get you to use a range of styles. So complete the profile. I'll send it out to you. Just go to click on the link, download it, fill it out, paper and pencil. Just have it in front of you next time we meet in a fortnight, and that would be very, very good. All right, that's about it for me, folks, unless there's any other questions, and it doesn't look like there is. So, oh, sorry, we've got one there I'll deal with. I know some staff were able to attend today's webinar. Can I forward mine to them to complete? Yes, yes, Tracy, that's not a bad idea. Get other people to fill it out for you is a good idea. Can you send this to us? Yeah, Denise, you'll be getting it. You'll be getting it over the weekend with the slides. It'll just be, you just click on the link and away you go. Thanks, Chelsea. Thanks, Tim. Okay. Thank you, Steve. Thanks, Denise. Yeah, guys, have a great weekend. Have some fun. Have a look at your team in a different light. Thanks, Gavin. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Sean. Great. Thank you, guys. Thanks, Elsie. Thanks, Denise. All right, all the best. I will sign off at this point, and we will meet again, of course, in a fortnight. Thanks, guys. Bye. Bye for now. Have a good weekend.